Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Caroline Roberts, producer and also an occasional host. On this episode, I'm first happy to bring you a conversation about the Equality Act, a bill recently passed by Congress that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But the bill would create more problems than solve, bringing with it inequality and threats to religious liberty. In the second segment of this episode, we take a look at the supposedly utopian system in Sweden and speak with a newly elected Swedish member of the European Parliament, Charlie Weimers, who reveals the reality of censorship in Sweden. If you want to read more about the topics in this episode and check out any of the articles that I'll be referencing, you can go to our show notes, which I publish every Wednesday when our episodes release at blog.acton.org. Also, last but not least, don't forget to swing over to our website at acton.org/line and subscribe to this podcast. We're available on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, or wherever you listen. A few weeks ago, Congress voted to pass the Equality Act to ban discrimination against LGBT people in workplaces, public accommodations, and housing. But the bill is more than it appears on the surface. In the name of banning discrimination and furthering so-called equality, it would threaten women's rights, freedom to speech, and religious freedom. To help me break down just how dangerous the Equality Act is, Keisha Russell, Associate Counsel to First Liberty Institute, a nonprofit law firm dedicated to defending religious freedom, joins me on the podcast. Keisha, thank you for joining me on Acton Line.
Thank you so much for having me, Carolyn.
So this Equality Act, or H.R. 5 now, it creates a new protected class of people based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and it's enacted, of course, at the federal level. We know that there are already a number of states, 21 to be exact, actually, that have non-discrimination laws protecting LGBT people. These states are penalizing business owners for their beliefs about marriage and gender. What are some examples of this that you've seen?
So our clients, Aaron and Melissa Klein, in Oregon were penalized for their religious convictions. They're cake bakers, and they were unable to bake a cake due to their religious beliefs. And because of the state's non-discrimination laws, they fined that business $135,000, and they were forced to close. Right now we have a petition pending with the Supreme Court to review that decision. But that's one example. There are a number of others, I think, that you can find. Jack Phillips' case in Colorado, of course, is a pretty popular example of those state non-discrimination laws really influencing Christian businesses. But a very parallel situation to Aaron and Melissa Klein, a cake baker who said he could not participate and create a custom cake for a wedding that violated his religious beliefs, and he was treated with some pretty outright hostility by Colorado. And I think the Supreme Court, made it very clear that, people still have religious rights in this country.
So I just want to highlight how broad this bill is, because even though those laws that you were just referencing are being enacted at the state level, they're still extremely dangerous. So it's, I think right now, a little hard to comprehend just how much more dangerous it would be at the federal level. Because the Equality Act, the bill says that it would protect LGBT individuals in, quote, public accommodations including bathrooms, healthcare facilities, adoption and foster care providers, and broadly youth service providers. So say a foster care provider or adoption agency only wanted to place children in homes with a mother and father. Even on religious grounds, those agencies would be penalized, either slapped with a very big fine or maybe even have their doors closed. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And as a matter of fact, if you look at states like Massachusetts, California, they've had faith-based adoption agencies that have been working in those states for 100 years. Catholic Charities had to close in those states. San Francisco, I believe, was a city in California, and then in Massachusetts, it was in Boston. But these are entities that have been serving the community in adoption and foster care before even the government was providing those services. Both of those entities had been around for 100 years, and because of those non-discrimination laws, and because, it was a complete violation of the religious beliefs of those agencies to place children with any other couples that were not a married mother and father, they were forced to close.
If I'm interpreting this correctly, then the Equality Act would basically denying provisions made in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Can you explain that a bit for me? Like how does the
Sure.
Religious Freedom Restoration Act play a part in this conversation?
Great. So that's a great question. So first, I want to just sort of explain that, like you said, it seeks to expand, the classes protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It also broadens the public accommodation definition. So, like you said, it includes foster and adoption care and all of that, but it also uses the word gatherings to cover gatherings. And a lot of times, facilities that are historically owned by religious organizations and churches, so like shelters and food banks and things like that. So it broadly expands that definition, and then it explicitly refers to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and says that you cannot use that federal law as a defense whenever the Equality Act is being used to enforce, non-discrimination for some reason. So essentially what it seeks to do is repeal the Religious Freedom Restoration Act on the federal level without actually seeking a repeal of that act.
So this bill is on its way to the Senate to be voted on, and it likely won't be passed. But what does the future of this bill look like?
Well, it passed the House, and it's been presented to the Senate as of the end of, I believe, May. But at this point, it's not expected to pass the Senate, mostly because there's still a pretty large majority of people who support RFRA, particularly the Republicans, of course, but it's not expected to get the support necessary to actually become law. But the thing that people really need to pay attention to is, that could change at any time once the Democrats control both the House and the Senate, and possibly the White House. So it's something to really pay attention to, because if this were to pass, that would be a very huge blow to religious liberty in America.
Yeah. And I believe that this bill, we're probably going to continue seeing it be attempted to be passed, at least throughout our kids' generations until it is. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I think it is safe to say. I don't think that the Democrats will stop anytime soon trying to pass this bill. And so, yeah, I think it's safe to say that they will keep trying.
Thomas Farr, who is the president at the Religious Freedom Institute, said it well in a piece for A Real Clear Policy. He wrote that, quote, "The Equality Act will harm American democracy by privileging one view of sexuality and human nature and silencing another." I mean, ultimately, this bill is defining dissent of thought as discrimination. It's a complete rehashing of terms throughout the whole entire bill.
Right, and I definitely agree. I think it definitely refers to the belief that marriage is between a man and a woman as, quote unquote, a sex stereotype. When we know that there are many, many Americans who have a sincerely held religious belief that is, what marriage is, and trying to define that in such a way that would eliminate a religious dissenter's right to believe that and act in accordance with that belief, I think is extremely dangerous on a lot of levels. It's like you were saying, faith-based adoption agencies and all kinds of churches. And one of the other, areas that could be possibly affected by this is schools, even religious schools. If you begin to say that they are not exempt from certain usual religious accommodations as it relates to, say, bathrooms and restrooms and locker rooms and those kinds of things, then you're looking at a huge change there, and definitely a huge change in viewpoint in terms of whether that's a valid religious belief as opposed to just being a stereotype that deserves no protection.
If this bill were passed, or I should say, unfortunately, when it is passed, perhaps, what are some likely scenarios we would see in religious institutions that refuse to affirm government-sanctioned definitions of sexuality and gender?
Well, I mean, you're going to see many of those longstanding service providers, your shelters and things like that. Those entities that are owned by churches, many of them are going to close rather than violate their religious beliefs. You're definitely going to see a lot of litigation. And though the Equality Act would repeal RFRA, you're still going to have your constitutional defenses, and that means case law like Masterpiece would still, be valid and, something you could use as a defense in some cases. But it would make it, very difficult, I think, to challenge, this law in court. Especially if you're going to use, wanting to use what would typically be a RFRA defense.
What would your last words about this bill be? What do you think is most important to understand?
Well, I think if the purpose in any case is to build equality or to eliminate discrimination, and I think if that is the case, I don't think we can do that by elevating one group of people over another. I think once you've elevated one group of people over another, then you've gone into the realm of bias, and I think there is a way to balance these like new secular views with the old religious views, but I don't think the Equality Act is it. And I do think that it's really important for all of us to understand, how important freedom of conscience really is, and that it extends beyond, social norms. And it's something that we should protect because everyone has their own beliefs, everyone has beliefs of conscience, and, religious liberty doesn't just protect people who have traditional religious views. They protect the minority views and your own, people who have conscience beliefs that you may not be able to categorize into like a normal, traditional Judeo-Christian viewpoint or something. And all of those people benefit from having religious protection. Everyone benefits from it. And so it's just really important that we understand that getting rid of religious freedom is not the way to enhance equality in this country.
Keisha, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
You're welcome. I really appreciate being on.
Every year in June, Acton University brings together nearly 1,000 people in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to explore the foundations of a free society. And this year, we're excited to be opening registration for each evening's dinner and plenary session for those who can't attend the full conference. Join us on the evening of June 18 to hear Mary Ann Kalam, a politician in Estonia, speak firsthand about her witness of Soviet-occupied Estonia and her work to champion freedom after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Save your spot at this event before seats fill up and register at acton.org/events.
This is Trey Dimsdale, the Director of Program Outreach at the Acton Institute. I'm joined today on our podcast, Acton Line, with Charlie Weimers, who is a newly elected member of the European Parliament from Sweden, and also an Acton alum who attended Acton University and has also cooperated with us on a few things that we've done in Europe. Charlie, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Trey.
And congratulations on that election. I'm sure you're exhausted. It was just this past weekend, and so I understand this is your first American interview, and I am honored that you would join us here on our podcast for that occasion. So, Charlie, your campaign slogan during the weeks leading up to the election was "More Sweden, Less Brussels." Could you tell us a little bit about what you mean by that phrase?
I think that a lot of Americans can sort of figure out what we mean with less Brussels. Brussels is very much like Washington. It's over-regulating. It's trying to tax Europeans. They have failed so far because of the national vetoes on tax policy, but they are trying to move as much power, political power, different areas from the member states to the bureaucracy here in Brussels. And we don't agree with that. We don't agree with the big European parties here in Brussels going together to form a sort of grand coalition between socialists, center-right people, liberals, in favor of an ever closer union. We want European cooperation, but based on intergovernmentalism instead of supranationalism. This is the big issue at stake in Europe, in European politics, and a lot of Swedes really found that message attractive. So we went up from 2 to 3 seats out of Sweden's 20 seats, so 15%, which we are very happy about.
I'd like to pivot a bit, Charlie, to talk about a new book that's come out that you were kind enough to write a review for us. It's called Sweden's Dark Soul, The Unravelling of a Utopia, by Swedish journalist Kajsa Norman. It came out from Hearst Publishers, I guess, in Europe back at the end of 2018, but it's just recently been released in the United States. And so we were fortunate enough to get to enlist you to take a look at that for us. Could you provide a little bit of background for this book? Being somebody who's immersed in Swedish culture, you could know a little bit better, the background from which this author is writing.
The book is about a country that has invested so much in presenting my country as this very peaceful, liberal, post-national utopia. And at any instance, another image has come out from Sweden for an international audience. The political leadership has been very quick to denounce any attempt to sort of black paint Sweden internationally. It's really a big issue for the media, for politicians, the image of Sweden. So Kajsa Norman is an expat. She has written many interesting books. One about South Africa, and as well as about Venezuela. And she often writes her book through the lens of individuals. She starts by depicting how many hundreds of sexual violations took place during a festival in Stockholm called We Are Stockholm in 2015. And the whole situation was very much like what happened in Cologne. I think it was the same year, New Year's Eve. But what we saw in conjunction to these sexual violations who were committed by immigrants, almost every one of them, was that despite very well-established people trying to report to the media what had happened, the media did not go public with it. The police basically decided to not go public as well. So it was more or less a cover-up by official Sweden because of the fact that this would disturb the sort of harmonious picture that the establishment was trying to portray to Swedes and to the rest of the world post the migration crisis 2015. So she depicts a country in a moral crisis, a country that brands itself a moral superpower. I'm not joking. It's really what some politicians are calling us. She does it brilliantly. She always found Sweden too boring to write about, but unfortunately, Sweden has become exciting enough to merit a book, and I recommend reading it to anyone.
So what you've described there with the We Are Stockholm festival, now, was that a music festival or was that some sort of a cultural festival?
It was a music festival, so you had top artists like Sarah Larsson, who's very popular among teenagers, 20-year-olds, and other big artists. And it was a festival which was free, tax-funded, not free for taxpayers, but for anyone who showed up. And you had this, surrounding of individual girls and sexually harassing them in the midst of the the audience without, police or guards being able to spot who was the perpetrator, what was going on. It was, by the perpetrator. It was very thought through, and the police there were powerless. They got some perpetrators, but let them go after half an hour or whatever. It was a really bizarre situation, which is, I think, unimaginable in the United States. Kajsa Norman has lived in the United States, and she compared it to, I think she lived in Arizona or something, and she said, like, people,
been up in arms,
would have stood their ground in a way that no one did in Stockholm, and it's quite a depressing review of the state of Sweden of today.
So this title, "We Are Stockholm," was this designed to be a celebration of this multicultural ideal that Sweden is trying to peddle?
I think it was basically a PR product, and everyone's included, and this diversity is a word that is not neutrally used by many Swedes, but in itself described as something positive. So yes, I assume that was part of the plan when they set this festival up.
So the fact that this never showed up really and got much traction in the Swedish press, was this, a result of unofficial political or cultural pressure, or did it involve actual official censorship?
And not official censorship, no, but unofficial censorship. A lot of Swedish journalists left the principle of consequence neutrality. So, which means that you're reporting what you see, you do it in a neutral fashion, and you do it even if consequences are bad, because it is the truth. You report the truth. And a lot of Swedish journalists, in cases that had with immigrants to do especially, they went away from that principle. They threw it overboard. When criminals are on the run and they have committed something and they happen to be from another background, it's often not even mentioned that, hair color or whatever, things that could actually help the public, help the police finding him. We also, during 2015, had an unofficial policy from the National Police Headquarters that any crime committed by an asylum seeker would go under Code 291, so that when the newspapers and the public looked at the records, they would not see the nature of the crime, the description of the perpetrator, but only Code 291. So even if the newspaper in this instance did not act under official pressure from the Swedish government, there was at the same time this Code 291, which was, even though it was not publicly expressed by the police, it was a policy that went up nationally, and its only goal was to keep the public unaware of the problems connected with the big migration wave 2015.
So historically, Sweden has been a very homogenous society, but it's also been a safe society with relatively low crime rates, and serious crime seems to be somewhat rare and tends to shock the Swedish population when this happens. Now, we've talked about this, several times in private conversations when the tape's not rolling, and it's clear neither one of us believe there's something inherent about these other cultures that are entering into Swedish society that are, somehow prone to committing crimes or serious crimes. But the reality is that this is a destabilizing force inside of a society that's benefited from very strong social cohesion for many generations. And so we're also seeing kind of at the same time that this is happening, Sweden also has become one of the most secular countries in the world, with the Church of Sweden essentially being disestablished just recently, but with a lot of empty churches. Is there any comment that you have about the way that seems to be, if that's a factor in any of this in your observation?
The lack of a joint idea about who we are is partly connected to the fact that we don't, in the same way, meet each other in churches anymore. We also have been able to take Sweden for granted. We have not been in war for more than 200 years, so patriotism is not a positive word in Sweden, and we have this situation where it's more correct as an official to question the existence of a Swedish culture than to actually claim that there is a Swedish culture. I'm not exaggerating. I'm really not exaggerating.
Well, a prime minister recently didn't, I can't remember the exact quote, but one of the Swedish prime ministers in the last 10 years or so has said that nothing has come out of Swedish culture but barbarism, or I can't remember precisely the quote. I'm sure you remember. It probably outraged you at the time and still probably does.
Yeah. The origin of Swedishness is barbarism. It's quite close to what he actually said, like a spontaneous translation on my side. And he was the so-called conservative prime minister, of course not being conservative in any real sense, but on paper he was. And he was then in an election challenged by a social democratic party leader, Mona Sahlin, who was quoted once telling the Turkish Youth Association of Sweden that, yeah, you guys have a real culture. We Swedes, we only have midsummer celebration and other weird stuff or lame stuff. So that was her view on Swedish culture. And last year, when UNESCO asked countries whether they wanted to send something in for, getting an official World Heritage stamp, the Swedish government said that, we don't have any specifically Swedish, so we abstain from sending anything in from our country. And today, this is like a normal day in Sweden.
Wow. Well, Charlie, our time is up, and I can't tell you how glad I am to see that your people have elected you to the European Parliament. We're quite pleased here at Acton to have gotten the news over the weekend, and it's been a true honor to be able to for us to be the home of your very first American interview. The book that we mentioned is Sweden's Dark Soul: The Unravelling of a Utopia by Kajsa Norman from Hearst Publishings. It's available here in the U.S. just this month. We would recommend that you take a look at the review that Charlie wrote for us. It'll be running at the same time that you're hearing this podcast. Charlie, thanks so much. Congratulations again.
Thank you very much, Trey.
Thank you for listening today. If you have any feedback about this podcast, I would love to hear it. Every week, our podcast team is working to bring you the best show, and we couldn't do it without you. Let me know what you think about this podcast and email me at actonline@acton.org. This episode of Acton Line was produced and edited by me, Caroline Roberts, with audio mixing by Doug Nagel.